Welcome back to Everything History. Glad to have you here for episode 9 as we continue our journey through one of the most complex historical events of all time, the French Revolution of 1789. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe on iTunes, and with that out of the way, roll sound.
I discharged my last duty as King and Emperor.
This is Everything History.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
We meant more to kids than Jesus did, or religion at that time.
I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Before episode 9 gets underway, we must check out what happened previously on Everything History. In the previous 4 episodes, we have followed the story of France's old regime, or the Ancien regime. Old regime simply refers to France before 1789, and it is a term sort of constructed by historians after the fact in order to simplify the nomenclature of French history. And we have followed that old regime's decline by sorting through the causes of the French Revolution, and by winding our way through 1787, 88, all the way up to May of 1789. During those years, King Louis XVI struggled again and again to reform his nation and his government. Each time the reforms were pushed back, and the king was eventually pressured to convene the Estates General. And in the last episode, we followed the campaigns of the Third Estate and the elections for the delegates or deputies to the Estates General. And we left off at the end of April after the violent Réveillon riots in Paris racked in over 300 casualties. So now the journey continues. The 1,200 or so deputies were getting prepared for the meeting of the estates, and the government was praying for stability. The king and his influential financial minister, Jacques Necker, could only hope that there would be no further riots and civilian unrest. The public, for their part, waited for the estates, but in the meantime, the common people of France were preparing for the worst. They really did desperately hope that freedom and liberty were on the way, and that a path to recovery was on the horizon, but their attitude was not at all sunshine and rainbows. Clearly, after all, the people had started the Réveillon riot on rumor alone, and it had been no coincidence that the rallying cry of those riots had been, "Death to the rich, death to the aristocrats." So I would correct anyone that says the people of the Third Estate were entirely hopeful. Instead, I would say that they were reserved, but optimistic. Reserved being the key word, and in this case I mean that the people hoped the Estates General would bring social change, but if it didn't, they were prepared to force change upon their nation. And at 2 separate occasions previously, blood had already been spilt, and they were fully prepared to do it again. That being said, Paris and Versailles were transformed as May began. Decorations and celebrations began spreading throughout as the government began welcoming the delegates. Yet on May 2nd, a peaceful protest of farmers and poor gathered to ask, beg, and demand for grain for the starving poor in and around Paris. This peaceful protest numbered at nearly 3,000 people, but they were readily dispersed by the Swiss Guard. The guards also threatened to use cannon artillery if any protest turned violent or disruptive. In other words, the government was cracking down and they meant business. They wanted to get the Estates General over with. And the day of the procession being when all the delegates walked to the Palais Royal in Versailles, was to be on Monday, the 4th of May. The night before the grand procession, 2 American founding fathers dined together and discussed the times they were living in. These 2 were Thomas Jefferson and Gouverneur Morris, and they had been living in France for some time representing the interests of the United States. Another good friend of theirs joined them as well. This man was Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero of the American Revolution and one of the prominent leaders of the Second Estate delegation. Much of what they talked about was the uneasy state that France was in at the moment, and they gave certain recommendations to Lafayette about the upcoming Estates General. They stressed the values of republicanism, liberty, and personal freedom as major points of interest, but most interestingly, Jefferson and Morris advised strong leadership. Neither of the Americans believed King Louis had that ability, but they hoped that Necker, at least, had a stronger nerve. Marquis de Lafayette wholly agreed with him, and before they departed, the 3 friends agreed that if the government did not possess the courage for leadership, then the people were obligated to step up to the plate. And I find that dinner right there, between Jefferson, Morris, and Lafayette, to be fascinating. Not only because of the prowess of their names, which is pretty great, but because of how interesting their conversation is in retrospect. Their discussion would foreshadow great change in the coming months, and I will bring this dinner up again later when it becomes truly relevant. The procession began in all its grandeur the next day, and it was the definition of pomp and circumstance. All accounts agree on the word magnificent to describe the arrival of the delegation. The delegates for the clergy walked first in their vestments, the second estate marched next in silk, with gold-cloth waistcoats, swords at their hips, and a white-plumed hat upon their heads. Lastly, to the great appreciation of the crowd, came the third estate deputies dressed in black. After everyone filed into the chamber for the assembly of the estates, business began to start. But business began slow, for the king was to speak first and after him 2 of his ministers. Before we hit those, though, we must talk about etiquette. The French government and society took etiquette extremely seriously, and this was to cause some problems. For example, there was a custom that was retained that required third estate members to kneel every time before speaking to the king. And there were dozens, if not hundreds, of these little pieces of etiquette, and the aristocracy and old guard of France expected everyone to observe each and every little nicety. You can probably see where this is going. Not everyone in the third estate, or even the nobility for that matter, remembered the precise etiquette. This would cause awkward problems from the beginning. That being the case, King Louis XVI came out dressed in the custom of 1614 in honor of tradition. The king opened the session with a speech, if it could be called that. You see, there was nothing wrong with the speech, but there was definitely nothing right with it either. The American Mr. Morris described it as, quote, short, very proper, and well spoken, or rather read. The tone and manner had all the fierté which can be expected from the blood of the Bourbons. That last part about it being expected from the blood of the Bourbons was a bit of a dig about how the French royal family, the Bourbon family or the Bourbon dynasty, was very well known for stuttering and being annoyingly timid and quiet when it came to public meetings. And while the king's opening speech was, in a word, lackluster, it only got worse from there. As the king stepped away, some of the etiquette we spoke of previously creeped in. The king removed his diamond-studded plumed hat and waved to the delegates as tradition dictated. The nobility, in proper custom, removed theirs, and the third estate followed suit. The king then placed his hat back on, as did the nobility, but custom dictated that the third estate was to keep their hats off as a demonstration of their unprivileged status. The third estate members were clueless to this formality, though, and put their hats back on. This breach of etiquette sent hushed whispers throughout the building, and confusion ensued. Some members of the third removed their hats again, but that only increased the confusion further, and the king ended up removing his own hat again, which was viewed as a major mistake, and this was all later known as the Great Hat Fiasco. Now, the whole reason I mention this hat controversy is for 2 reasons. Number 1, mainly it's hilarious, and number 2, it foreshadowed how bad the Estates General was going to function in the future. Because what followed was no better. The Keeper of the Seals, Charles de Barentin, pronounced it incorrectly I'm sure, delivered a far longer speech to the estates. It lasted about an hour, and all sources describe it as a horrible display of public speaking. First-hand accounts describe the speech as, quote, ungraceful and incoherent. It seems that Barentin was speaking of taxes, but no one could really understand him. He was speaking quickly, nervously, and not loud enough for all to hear. Eventually Barentin did step down, and the next speaker was Jacques Necker, who spoke loudly, but evidently rambled. Quite literally, Necker spoke for 3 straight hours about government, taxes, and the economy. Mr. Morris took notes while the speech was going on, and he described it while he was listening to it by saying, quote, he tries to play the orator, but he plays it very ill. He speaks in a bad accent and an ungraceful manner. It is very long. It contains much information, but it is too long. End quote. And after Necker's long and quite frankly boring speech, the king and queen rose, and the first day of the Estates General was complete. No one was happy about it either. The delegates had expected business on the first day, or at least something close to it, and they had certainly not expected to be bored to tears on the first day of the long-awaited Estates General. One thing it did do, though, was animate the Third Estates delegation to get down to business the next day. So when the estates met again the next day, the Third Estate demanded to know how the procedures were to work, particularly how the voting was going to work. This was of extreme importance because in previous Estates Generals, the vote had been conducted by order, meaning each estate in total got only 1 vote, meaning there were only 3 votes, and that effectively meant that the clergy and nobles could outvote the Third Estate no matter how many representatives the Third had. The Third Estate assumed the king would change the vote to a head count system. Head voting means that each delegate would have a single vote. So if there was 1,200 delegates, there would be 1,200 votes. The Third Estate delegation had assumed this was the case, but on May 6th, to their horror, they learned that the king had yet to change the voting system. The leaders of the Third, notably Comte de Mirabeau and Abbé Sieyès, requested the change be made to the voting system immediately. The first two estates responded by protesting this move. So what did King Louis do? Well, in classic Louis fashion, he balked. He timidly told Mr. Necker that he would not decide. Rather, all three estates would have to agree on a course of action. Thus, the struggle in the Estates General began. The delegates roared and shouted their opinions, but absolutely nothing got done on May 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and so on. The estates were in absolute deadlock. And for the next several days, the orders did not meet as one, but separately. Great animosity and tension was building up as the days ticked by. And the Third Estate no longer began calling themselves the Third, or the Third Estate, but rather the Commons. Around May 14th, the three orders met again, but the Commons would not proceed unless the clergy and nobles agreed to a vote by head. And as you might imagine, once again, nothing got done. The Estates General was in deadlock still, and the only thing it was producing was anger and unrest. The inaction of the delegation had the king pacing throughout his palace, and the queen demanded Necker's removal. The people, for their part, were eerily quiet. The 97% of the population were waiting. They saw their idols and leaders as the delegates for the Third Estate, otherwise now known as the Commons, remember? King Louis was fed up as well and sought to fix the situation before it got any worse. His methods, though, were short-sighted, for remember, it only gets worse from here for France. You'll see what I mean in a second. Anyways, Louis XVI called forth all three estates for a joint session on May 29th. The arguing only continued further, and the Second Estate delegates pulled out of the talks entirely. The nobles refused to participate further unless the Commons relented on their demands. But the Commons had no intention of doing so. In fact, they were considering a more radical step. The Commons wanted to continue on with the assembly without the nobles. The Commons invited the clergy delegates to, quote, join them in the General Assembly Hall and there act in concert to bring about union and concord. The clergy was uneasy about the prospect of such a step and stalled the Commons from making a move. The king and queen were struck with terrible news, though, on June 4th. The crown prince of France, Louis Joseph, eldest son of King Louis, died at the young age of 8. And this could come at no worse time, for France desperately needed leadership, and this sent the monarchy reeling into seclusion as the king and queen grieved. But while the Commons expressed their condolences, they certainly did not agree with the 600,000 livres set aside for the funeral. And furthermore, they were running out of time and patience with the mockery that had become the Estates General of 1789. The Commons, or the Third Estate delegates, began to organize themselves with or without the clergy. They wanted action, and they were set on making it happen as the second week of June began. They elected a president to lead their assembly and began to discuss the creation of a national assembly in order to manage national affairs. Such a body would be unsanctioned, but the Commons no longer cared. They were willing to do something revolutionary. On June 10th, Abbé Sieyès officially proposed the move to create the National Assembly, and, as a peace offering, they invited the clergy and even the nobles to join them. But they noted that they would go ahead with or without them. The move was passed by the Commons, and after 2 days of no response from the other estates, they convened their National Assembly. The Englishman Arthur Young witnessed this event during his stay in France and described the National Assembly's creation as, quote, the spectacle of the representatives of 25 millions of people just emerging from the evils of 200 years of arbitrary power. Assembled with open doors under the eye of public, was framed to call into animated feelings every latent spark, every emotion of a liberal bosom, on the glorious idea of happiness to a great nation, of felicity to millions yet unborn. And that was much of the sentiment of most of France. They were very hopeful that a happy future was right around the corner, and many hoped the National Assembly would be the conduit of change. A fair amount of the clergy then joined the National Assembly, but aside from Marquis de Lafayette, almost no nobles joined the Assembly. The king had now gotten wind of the National Assembly's creation, and he refused to acknowledge its right to convene. The king dismissed the creation of the National Assembly by calling it, quote, just a phrase. And instead he announced that they were to leave the Assembly Hall of Versailles so business could continue with the Estates General, or what was left of it. In fact, the king called for a séance royale. A séance royale is a royal session that called all the king's advisors together. In this case, that meant the three estates of France, and he intended to ignore the National Assembly's creation and place the meeting of the séance royale at the Palais Royal Assembly Hall, which is where the National Assembly was currently convened. The delegates took this removal as an act of royal aggression, and instead of disbanding, they moved their meeting place to the royal tennis courts of Versailles. They then very famously reconvened on the tennis courts themselves in makeshift fashion, fully intent on solving the affairs of France without the king. The members then swore an oath in the summer heat, which is now seen as a glorious step towards liberty and freedom in France. This was the tennis court oath of the National Assembly on June 20th, 1789. The oath was approved and passed by 576 of the 577 present members, and they swore that, quote, "The National Assembly has been called to establish the constitution of the realm, and nothing may prevent it from continuing its deliberations," end quote. And they stated that the National Assembly may convene wherever its members are present, and that, quote, "that all members take a solemn oath never to separate until the constitution of the realm is established and fixed upon solid foundations." They continued their deliberations for several more days until on June 23rd, the royal session convened. Jacques Necker refused to attend due to complicated differences between himself and the House of Bourbon. At the royal session in Versailles, all three estates met before the king. Spectators were also not allowed in, and the hall was surrounded by military guard to keep them out. The king meant business, and when he came out to address the three estates, he was met without applause. It was a sobering situation, to say the least. He put forth a 35-point declaration that included the abolition of unjust imprisonment, forced labor, and serfdom. He also announced that no future taxes would be imposed without the approval of the Estates General. But he only suggested that the nobles and clergy give up their feudal privileges both in land and finances. He also gave the nobles and clergy a veto power over any proposition within the Estates General. He finished by declaring that all assembly actions had to be approved by himself, the monarch. The nobles and many of the clergy gave their applause then, and the king dismissed the delegates until the next day. But then something frightening happened. The Third Estate and their patriot allies, in other words the National Assembly, refused to leave. They sat in silence as the nobles and many of the clergy filed out. The king reiterated his order of dismissal, but Comte de Mirabeau stood up and retorted that nothing but bayonets could force the National Assembly to separate. This was open defiance to the King of France. The rest of the assembly roared in approval, and in unison reiterated their tennis court oath. And what did Louis XVI do? He relented. The National Assembly was allowed to stay in the Palais Royal, of all places. When the king left in disgrace, he was also met with the resignation of Jacques Necker. The public then exploded into view, and they only chose to listen to the National Assembly. Crowds of people stormed the streets of Versailles and into the grounds of the royal palace. Arthur Young described it by saying, quote, "The ferment in Paris is beyond conception. 10,000 people have been all day in the Palais Royal. The people reject all idea of compromise. They are also suspicious at Mr. Necker's resignation." The king then pleaded for Necker to come back, and he finally agreed to, but this did Louis no favors. The people were indeed in a frenzy. The crowd swelled by the day, and Paris had now fallen victim to the protests. Regiments of the French Guard were called in to break up the crowds, but here too the king met with resistance. The troops in Versailles overwhelmingly refused to act on the patriotic crowds, and 2 whole companies even refused to go to Paris. As an explanation of their negligence of duty, one soldier wrote, quote, "What could prevent such disorder?" Indeed, the troops and police had no power over the public uprising unless they resorted to violence. King Louis refused such a measure, though, and he hoped that the situation would begin to calm down. In the meantime, the National Assembly had risen to prominence, and the crowds looked to it as a beacon of liberty. Let's slow down a bit here and catch our breath on all of the events that occurred in the fast-paced week between June 19th and the 26th. During that week, the king lost control of the Estates General by succumbing to the defiance of the National Assembly. The government as a whole was in limbo as thousands of people chanted in the streets, and the military's loyalty was now wavering. In other words, in the past week, King Louis and the old regime had lost power. Oh yes, the power had shifted to the National Assembly and the mob of people in the streets. The shift was not yet entirely complete, but the monarchy of France was now on its deathbed. To solidify this point, on June 27th, the King and Queen announced over their balcony at the Royal Palace that the National Assembly was thenceforth the official legislative body of France. He then ordered the nobles and remaining clergy to join the National Assembly. At this news, the mobs roared in celebration and praised the wisdom of their king. Once again, our historical friend, Arthur Young, was witness to this event, and he noted, quote, "And the whole business seems over and the revolution was complete." End quote. It certainly seems so, and it would be pleasant to write the French Revolution off here, but nothing could be further from the truth. The real revolution was about to begin. But alas, that is for next episode. When we return, the National Assembly will try and manage affairs, the National Guard will be created, and the storming of the Bastille is just around the corner. Indeed, much more is soon to occur. And be sure to join us next time on Everything History.
Thank you, and good night.